Blood and moonlight. Marco sprinted, his lungs burning, Carla's hand clutching his. The night air was thick with the coppery tang of blood and the echo of gunshots. They weaved through parked cars, their pursuers hot on their trail. A bullet whizzed past Marco's ear, close enough to feel the heat. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat urging him forward. Carla stumbled, her breath ragged. "Marco, I can't," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. He pulled her along, his grip tightening. "We have to keep moving," he growled, his voice strained. They couldn't stop, not now, not with their lives hanging by a thread. The alley opened into a narrow street, the glow of a neon sign casting an eerie light. Marco risked a glance back. Two figures, shadows against the moonlit buildings, were gaining on them. They had to disappear, vanish into the labyrinthine streets. Their lives depended on it. He pushed Carla ahead of him, his hand instinctively going to the warm stickiness spreading across his side. He'd been hit, he realized, the pain a dull throb beneath the adrenaline. But there was no time to think about it, not now. They had to reach the sanctuary of the shadows. A desperate flight. Carla's legs screamed in protest, but she forced herself onward. The rhythmic thud of Marco's footsteps echoed her own, a shared heartbeat in the darkness. She risked a glance at his face, etched with pain and determination, and a surge of fear tightened her throat. They were in too deep, she knew, caught in a web of their own making. The city lights blurred into streaks of color as they raced through the night. Each breath felt like a victory, each step a testament to their will to survive. But the city, once their playground, now felt like a hunting ground, the shadows teeming with unseen dangers. Marco stumbled again, his face contorted in pain. "We need to get off the streets," he gasped, his words punctuated by ragged breaths. Carla nodded, her fear for him eclipsing her own terror. They needed to vanish, to become ghosts in the urban jungle. They ducked into a narrow doorway, the stench of urine and decay assaulting their nostrils. Carla leaned against the cold brick, her chest heaving. Marco slumped beside her, his eyes closed, his face pale. They were alive for now, but their pursuers were relentless. They had to disappear. Shadows on the highway. The highway stretched before them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the darkness. They had ditched Carla's car hours ago, a smoldering wreck left behind as a decoy. Now they walked along the shoulder, two solitary figures swallowed by the vastness of the night. A truck roared past, its headlights momentarily illuminating their faces. Marco winced, his hand instinctively going to his side. The bleeding had slowed, but the pain was a constant reminder of their precarious situation. "We need a car," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Carla scanned the horizon, her eyes searching for any sign of life. The highway seemed deserted, the only sounds the distant drone of engines and the sighing wind. They were exposed, vulnerable. "We'll find something," she said, her voice a mixture of hope and desperation. A flicker of red in the distance caught her eye. She squinted, her heart quickening. A car, its tail lights glowing like malevolent eyes, was parked on a side road leading off the highway. It was a long shot, but it was their only hope. The last stop. The motel was a relic from a bygone era, its neon sign flickering a faded welcome. The parking lot was deserted except for a lone pickup truck, its paint peeling and its tires flat. The air hung heavy with the smell of mildew and despair. Marco leaned heavily against Carla as they made their way across the cracked asphalt. His steps were slow, his breath shallow. "Help me get inside," he whispered, his voice weak. Carla nodded, her heart aching at his obvious pain. The motel room was small and dingy, the air thick with the smell of stale cigarettes. Carla helped Marco onto the bed, his body sinking into the stained mattress. He groaned, his face contorted in pain. I need something for this," he gasped, gesturing to his side. Carla rummaged through her purse, her heart sinking as she realized the truth. They were out of options, out of time. They were trapped, with nowhere left to run and no one to turn to. whispers in the dark. Carla sat beside Marco, watching as he slept fitfully. The motel room was silent, save for the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner and the occasional groan escaping Marco's lips. He was burning up, his skin clammy to the touch. Infection, she knew, was setting in. They needed a doctor, antibiotics, but those were luxuries they could no longer afford. She looked down at her hands, calloused and scarred. Hands that had held guns, dealt drugs, taken lives. Hands that were now desperately trying to hold on to the man she loved. But how long could they outrun their past, their enemies? Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. Were they coming for them? Had someone tipped them off? Paranoia, a constant companion in their world, gnawed at the edges of her mind. Marco stirred beside her, his eyes fluttering open. "Carla?" he rasped, his voice weak. She leaned closer, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "It's okay, I'm here," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were living on borrowed time. Nowhere left to run. Marco's breathing grew shallow, each breath a struggle. Carla watched him, her heart breaking. He needed a hospital, but getting him there would be suicide. They were surrounded, their enemies closing in. She could feel it in her gut, a primal instinct screaming at her to flee, but where could they go? They were out of options, backed into a corner with no escape. Their life on the run, the constant fear and adrenaline had caught up with them. They had lived by the sword, and now it seemed they were destined to die by it. Carla felt a strange sense of calmness wash over her. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it was different now. It was the calm before the storm, the acceptance of fate. They had made their choices, and now they had to face the consequences. She looked down at Marco, his face pale and drawn, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. She wouldn't leave him. Not now, not ever. They would face whatever came their way together. It was the least they could do for each other. The turning point. A strange calm settled over Carla. It wasn't peace, not exactly. It was more like a quiet resignation. They were out of options, backed into a corner. But instead of fear, she felt a surge of defiance. They might be going down, but they were going down fighting. Marco's eyes fluttered open, glazed with pain and fever. "Carla?" he rasped, his voice barely audible. She took his hand, her touch gentle despite the storm raging inside her. "We're going to be okay," she lied. The words meant more for her than him. She knew better. They both did. This wasn't a movie. There was no magical escape, no last-minute rescue. This was it, the final act, and they were going to write the ending. Marco coughed, a rattling sound that tore at her heart. "No more running," he whispered, his voice surprisingly strong. Carla nodded, a fierce determination hardening her features. He was right. It was time to stop running, time to turn and fight. Carla moved with a practiced grace, checking the beretta, its weight familiar in her hand. The motel room, once a haven, now felt like a cage. They couldn't stay here, not with Marco's condition worsening and their enemies closing in. She dug into a backpack, pulling out ammunition, a spare clip. Her movements were swift, economical. Years on the run had taught her to be prepared, to be ruthless. Survival depended on it, and tonight, survival meant more than just staying alive. Marco watched her, his gaze fever-bright. He struggled to sit up, wincing at the pain that lanced through him. "Let me help," he rasped, his hand reaching for another weapon, a sleek Glock. Carla hesitated, then nodded. He might be weak, but he was still dangerous. "Save your strength," she said, her voice softer than intended. He gave her a wry smile, a flicker of the old Marco. "Always looking out for me, Carla," he murmured. She returned his smile, a silent vow passing between them. They were in this together until the very end. The setting sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of the motel parking lot. Carla stood beside Marco, his arm draped over her shoulder, his weight leaning heavily against her. He was pale, sweat beading on his forehead, but his eyes were clear, his grip on her arm surprisingly strong. "This is it," he whispered, his voice rough but steady. Carla nodded, her gaze sweeping the deserted parking lot. They had chosen their battleground, a last stand in a forgotten corner of a dying town. There was a grim poetry to it, a sense of coming full circle. The first car arrived, its engine rumbling like a predator scenting its prey. Two men emerged, their faces hard, their movements practiced. They were professionals, Carla could tell, which meant they were in for one hell of a fight. "Ready?" Marco asked, his voice barely audible above the wind. Carla squeezed his hand, her grip firm. "Ready," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. They were outgunned, outmatched, but they had one thing their enemies didn't, nothing left to lose. The air crackled with tension, thick enough to choke on. Two more cars screeched into the parking lot, flanking the first. Men emerged, shadows stretching long in the fading light. Carla counted 6, maybe 7, all armed, all with the same look in their eyes, cold, calculating, deadly. A hush fell over the parking lot. It was the quiet before the storm, the moment of suspended breath before all hell broke loose. Carla felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching the scene unfold from a distance. The fear was still there, a knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce resolve. Marco shifted beside her, his grip tightening on her arm. "Don't hesitate," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "Don't you dare hesitate." Carla met his gaze, her own unwavering. She wouldn't. She had hesitated once before, and it had cost them dearly. Not this time. This time there would be no regrets. The silence stretched, each second an eternity. Then a figure stepped forward from the group, a sneer twisting his lips. "Well, well, well," he drawled, his voice dripping with malice. "Look what we have here. The game was on." The first gunshot shattered the stillness, echoing through the deserted parking lot. It was followed by another and another, the sounds blending into a deafening roar. Carla reacted instinctively, her body moving with a honed precision born of countless hours of practice, countless close calls. The world dissolved into a blur of motion and noise. Smoke stung her eyes, the smell of gunpowder acrid in her nostrils. She ducked behind a rusty car, the metal warm against her cheek. The staccato rhythm of gunfire, a deadly percussion. Beside her, Marco returned fire, his movement sharp, his aim true. Adrenaline surged through her veins, a potent cocktail of fear and exhilaration. She was alive, for now, but the world had shrunk to the confines of this asphalt battlefield. Survival was measured in heartbeats, in the space between breaths. There was no time for fear, no room for doubt. Only the cold, hard focus of survival. She moved, a phantom in the gathering darkness, her gun a part of her, an extension of her will. This was her life, their life, distilled to its essence, fight or die, and they had chosen to fight.